The morning light cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor like it always did, sharp, indifferent, and entirely unmoved by the controlled chaos unfolding inside the offices of Vantage Technologies. Emily Carter stood at the edge of her desk, one hand flat against the glass surface, scanning 3 open browser tabs while her assistant rattled off the day's schedule in a practiced monotone. She was 34 years old, the youngest chief executive in the company's history, and she had not taken a full lunch break in 11 days. That was not a complaint. That was simply who she was. The calendar did not show weekends. The calendar showed deal timelines, board presentations, and the name of the contract that had consumed every waking hour for the past 6 weeks. Meridian Systems, $9 million. A strategic acquisition that would expand Vantage's infrastructure, reach into 3 new markets, and silence every doubting voice on the board who still whispered that she was too young, too aggressive, too much. She had heard those whispers. She filed them the way she filed everything under irrelevant. Emily's world ran on precision. Her assistant, Rachel, knew to have the black coffee ready before the elevator doors opened. Her legal team knew that she read every clause of every contract personally. Her drivers knew to be parked and ready 8 minutes before the scheduled departure, not 7, not 9. She had been called exacting by people who meant it as a criticism and accepted it as a compliment. The company had grown 43% in revenue since her appointment, and the board, the same board that had debated the wisdom of promoting her, had largely run out of things to say about her management style that were not, in some quiet way, reluctant admissions of respect. She had not built Vantage. She had inherited a company with a solid technical foundation and a leadership culture that had calcified around old habits and older personalities, and she had reshaped both with a patience that surprised people who expected aggression from her and an aggression that surprised people who expected patience. She was not difficult to understand, she thought. She was simply clear about what mattered and uninterested in the rest, which was why, when Rachel appeared in the doorway that Tuesday morning with the particular look she reserved for problems, Emily set down her pen without being asked. The previous driver, a quiet and reliable man named Dennis, who had worked with her for 2.5 years, had submitted an emergency resignation the evening before a family medical situation, entirely genuine, and Emily wished him well with the small, clipped sincerity she reserved for personal matters. But the timing was catastrophic. She had a 9:30 meeting across town, a midday call with Meridian's general counsel, and an afternoon session with her own board. Rachel had worked through the night with the staffing agency. The only available candidate on short notice was a man named Michael Turner. He had a clean record, a valid commercial license, and strong references. Rachel had approved him. Emily had not yet met him. She met him at 7:47 in the parking structure on the building's lower level. He was standing beside a dark company sedan, wearing a charcoal suit that was entirely presentable and entirely unremarkable. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of face that did not announce itself, steady eyes, a calm mouth, no particular urgency. He nodded when she approached and reached for the rear door handle with quiet efficiency. Emily looked at him the way she looked at all new staff. A single, evaluative glance that registered information without judgment, though in this case the glance lingered a half-second longer than usual. Something in his posture read differently than she expected. Not nervous, not eager. Composed in a way that seemed less like professional restraint, and more like a man who had simply stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. She said nothing. She got in the car. He drove. The drive to the meeting took 22 minutes in moderate traffic. Emily spent 19 of those minutes on her phone, working through an email chain with her head of corporate development. She spoke without lowering her voice, the way she always did in the car, treating the space behind the glass partition as functionally private. The Meridian deal was the topic. Her team had flagged a discrepancy in the revenue projections the other company had submitted. Not a red flag exactly, more of an ambiguity in the way deferred contracts were being counted. Her development director thought they were overvaluing existing pipeline by somewhere between 12 and 18%. Emily was inclined to press Meridian's CFO directly at the next session rather than signaling concern through counsel, a choice that carried its own risks. She spoke about this plainly, working through the logic aloud the way she always did when she needed to hear her own thinking. The car was quiet, except for her voice, and the soft hum of the engine. Then, from the front, Michael Turner said 3 words. "That's the trap." Emily lowered her phone. She did not say anything immediately. She looked at the back of his head in the rearview mirror, waiting. He kept his eyes on the road. "If you press the CFO directly," he said, not loudly, not with any particular inflection, "you signal that your team already found the gap. They'll restructure the projections before the next session, and you lose the advantage of knowing they know you've seen it." He paused. "Better to let your counsel raise it as a routine clarification. Keeps the information asymmetry in your favor." The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. Emily replaced the phone against her ear, told her development director she would call back in 20 minutes, and ended the call. She did not respond to Michael. She stared out the window for the remaining 3 minutes of the drive, processing what had just been said. It was correct. It was precisely correct. In fact, a clean read of a negotiation dynamic that most of her senior team had not articulated that cleanly. She told herself he had probably overheard enough business conversations in enough executives' back seats to pick up the vocabulary. She told herself it was a lucky insight, the kind a person occasionally stumbled onto through pattern recognition rather than expertise. She filed it. She went to her meeting, but when he held the door open at the building's entrance, and she stepped out without meeting his eyes, she was already, without quite admitting it to herself, paying attention. The meeting ran long. It always did when Meridian's team was involved. They favored the kind of extended preamble that dressed itself as collaboration while quietly consuming the time available for actual agreement. Emily recognized the technique. She had used it herself on occasion, in rooms where she needed time to read the other side before committing to a direction. By the time she was back in the car, heading toward the midday call, she was tightly wound and running 12 minutes behind schedule. She pulled up her notes on her tablet and began preparing her talking points for the council call. Michael drove without speaking. The city moved past the windows in segments: construction scaffolding, a stretch of older buildings, the glass frontage of a hotel that had been a landmark when she first moved to the city and had since been absorbed into the background like everything else that stayed in one place long enough. Emily finished her preparation and sat back. Then, because she was not entirely sure why, she said, "What did you mean, information asymmetry?" It was not exactly a question. He glanced at the mirror, just briefly. In a negotiation where both sides know the gap exists, but only one side knows the other side has found it, the side with that knowledge has more options, he said. You can use it to time your concession requests, or use it to structure a walkaway condition that looks generous but is actually protected. He said this the way someone says a thing they have said, or thought, many times before. Not rehearsed, settled, like a person quoting themselves from an earlier version of their own life. Emily put down her tablet. "Where did you study?" He did not answer right away. "Business school," he said eventually. She waited for more. He offered nothing. She returned to her tablet, but her concentration had fractured slightly. There was something about the quality of his silence that bothered her, not evasion exactly, but a kind of deliberate containment, as if he had decided long ago how much of himself he was willing to deploy in any given conversation, and had not yet decided to expand that limit for her. She found it, unexpectedly, a little irritating. She was accustomed to people who wanted things from her: approval, attention, influence. The minor validations that power tends to attract whether it invites them or not. This man appeared to want nothing at all, and in the particular ecosystem of corporate ambition she inhabited, that was unusual enough to register as a variable worth tracking. The call with Meridian's counsel was difficult. The ambiguity in the deferred contracts was raised. Emily had taken Michael's advice and routed it through her own legal team rather than pressing directly, a choice she made in the car and which, she acknowledged privately, came from a stranger's suggestion delivered in 20 seconds between traffic lights. Meridian's counsel responded defensively, which told her everything she needed to know about how much they were aware of their own exposure. Her legal team handled it well. By the time the call ended, Emily had a clearer picture of exactly where the vulnerability in the deal structure lived. And it was not a small one. She sat in the back of the car afterward, not looking at her phone, just thinking. You were right, she said, without planning to. About the information asymmetry. Michael did not say anything for a moment. Then, I hope the rest of it goes better than I think it will. She looked up. Meaning what? He kept his eyes forward. The deferred contract issue is a symptom. If it's structured the way it sounds, their pipeline is thinner than the number suggests, which means the valuation is built on a projection that doesn't hold. He paused. That's not a rounding error. That's a structural problem. Emily stared at the back of his headrest. She did not respond, but that evening, when she asked Rachel to pull the staffing file on Michael Turner, she was not entirely surprised by what she found. The file was thin in the way files are thin when someone has deliberately kept a low profile. His commercial driver's license was current. His references were solid, 2 prior corporate driving positions over the past 3 years, both with unqualified recommendations from the executives he had served. Before that, the record jumped. There was a degree listed. Master of Business Administration, Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Graduated with distinction. Emily read that twice. Then she asked Rachel to dig further. What Rachel found, working through public records and a subscription business database, was a company called Crestline Partners, a mid-sized consulting and venture firm that had, at its peak roughly 7 years prior, managed a portfolio valued at just over $40 million. The registered co-founder and managing director was listed as Michael J. Turner. Emily sat with that information for a long time. She read it the way she read contracts, looking for the clause she had missed, the line that changed the meaning of everything above it. A Wharton MBA, a $40 million firm, and now, a company sedan and a Tuesday morning drive through downtown traffic. The question was not small, and it did not have an obvious answer. And Emily was deeply uncomfortable with questions that did not have obvious answers. She did not mention any of it to him the next morning. She watched him instead, with the particular attention she reserved for things she did not yet understand. He was professional in a way that felt genuine, rather than performed doors opened without fanfare. Roots adjusted without being asked. The radio never on unless she wanted it, but it was the quality of his stillness that she kept returning to. Most people, in his position, would fill the silence with something. Small talk, deference, the minor social performances of service that function as both courtesy and self-protection. Michael Turner filled it with nothing. He existed in the car, the way a person exists in a space they are entirely comfortable occupying, regardless of where it ranks in any hierarchy they once cared about. On Thursday of that first week, during a drive to a lunch meeting she did not want to attend, she asked him directly, "You went to Wharton?" He looked in the mirror. "Yes, and before you drove cars, you ran a company." A longer pause this time. "Yes." She waited. He said nothing further for nearly a full minute. Then, "Sometimes losing everything is how life teaches you to see yourself clearly." It was not evasion. It was something older and more considered than evasion, a conclusion he had arrived at through a process she could not see the shape of yet, in a place she could not see from where she was sitting. She let it go, but she was watching, and he knew she was watching, and neither of them said anything about that either. 3 days later, Rachel found a business magazine article from 6 years prior. The cover image showed a younger version of Michael Turner's sharper suit, more confident posture, standing outside an office building in the financial district with the composed ease of a man who expects to be photographed. The headline called him one of the most innovative deal-makers under 40 in the Mid-Atlantic region. The article cited 2 transactions he had structured that had generated combined returns well above market expectations. His co-founder was mentioned briefly, in passing, in a single sentence. Emily read the article twice. She noted which details the profile had chosen to emphasize and which it had left out. And she thought about the space between what a profile shows and what it doesn't, and about the particular distance between a magazine cover 6 years ago and the front seat of a company car on a Tuesday morning. Then she set it aside and went back to the Meridian file, which was becoming, with each passing day, considerably more complicated. The second week was when the deal began to show its fractures in earnest. Meridian's team came back to the negotiating table with a revised term sheet that walked back 3 provisions Emily's team had considered effectively settled. The change to the earn-out structure alone threatened to reduce the practical value of the acquisition by close to $1.5 million over the first 2 years. Her board, 9 individuals who ranged from quietly supportive to openly skeptical of her leadership, called an emergency session. The atmosphere in the boardroom had the particular charge of people preparing to assign blame before anything has actually failed, the careful positioning of people who want to be on record as having been concerned, without being on record as having obstructed. Emily had sat through dozens of sessions like this. She knew exactly how to read the room, exactly whose anxiety was genuine and whose was performed, exactly which questions were being asked in good faith and which were being asked because the asker wanted the answer on the record. She sat through 2 hours of it and came out the other side feeling something she rarely permitted herself to feel in professional contexts, genuinely uncertain about which way the situation would break. The drive home that evening was quiet, in a way that had a different texture than the quiet of previous drives. Emily did not look at her phone. She looked out the window at the city in the dark, the amber streaks of headlights, the office towers still lit on their upper floors, the particular restless energy of a city that never quite stopped moving, even when the people inside it badly needed it to. Michael drove without speaking, as he always did when he sensed she needed the silence rather than the sound of her own thinking. She had noticed that about him the calibration, the precise and apparently instinctive sense of when to exist quietly and when something else was called for. It was a quality she associated with people who had spent significant time listening to things other than themselves. After several miles, she said, "They're trying to renegotiate the earnout." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Did they give a reason?" "Revised internal projections," she said. "Which almost certainly aren't revised at all. They're creating negotiating room they never built into the original term sheet." "That's a signal," he said. "About what?" "About what they know about their own numbers." She turned her head and looked at his profile in the passing light. "You keep coming back to their numbers, because the numbers are where this falls apart if it falls apart," he said. "Everything else is theater." She almost smiled at that. She had spent 6 weeks surrounded by people who talked about the Meridian deal in terms of relationships, market positioning, strategic narrative, and the management of perceptions both internal and external. The man driving her home was talking about it the way she thought about it privately, in the honest internal language she used when no one was listening, and the social requirements of leadership did not apply. She began, during that second week, to speak with him differently. Not unprofessionally, there were no late-night phone calls, no confessional conversations that crossed the careful lines she maintained between her professional and private self. But in the car, in the 20 and 30-minute windows of transit that punctuated her days, she began to think out loud with him in a way she did not do with her senior team, because her senior team was always, at some level, managing their own position relative to hers. There was no position for Michael to manage. He sat in the front seat of a company car and offered analysis with the calm detachment of someone who had left the arena of corporate ambition behind and was watching it now from a considered distance. It was, she realized, genuinely useful in a way that was different from useful in the ordinary sense. It was useful the way a good mirror is useful, not because it tells you what you want to see, but because it shows you what is actually there. On Wednesday of the second week, she mentioned not quite casually that Crestline Partners had had a strong run in its early years. He did not react visibly. "It did," he said. "What happened to it?" she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "My co-founder and I had different ideas about what the company was for. He thought it was for making money. I thought it was for building something worth having." Another pause. "He was better at the politics of the investor relationships. I was better at the actual work of finding and structuring value. Eventually, that kind of imbalance costs you, because the politics determines who gets to keep telling the story." She said nothing. He continued, not with any apparent desire to be heard so much as a willingness, for the first time, to let the account be accurate. The investors followed the narrative he was telling, not the one the numbers supported. By the time the real picture caught up with the story that had been built around it, there wasn't much left to salvage. and there wasn't a clean way to explain what had happened without it sounding like exactly the kind of thing people decide not to believe. He did not say this with bitterness. He said it the way a person reports a weather event that has long since passed accurately, without drama, without any apparent desire to revisit it, except as information. Emily looked at the road ahead. She thought about how many rooms she had sat in, across how many years, with people who wore their professional failures like accusations directed outward at others. This was not that. That night, checking in with her development director over the phone, she learned that Meridian had quietly engaged a second advisory firm in the previous 10 days, a detail their team had not disclosed. It was not a violation of anything explicitly agreed, but it was the kind of move that, in Emily's experience, meant one of two things. They were shopping for a better offer, or they were shoring up a position they knew was shakier than they had represented. Either way, the deal was in more trouble than the official conversations had suggested. She hung up the phone and sat alone in her home office for a long time. Then she texted Rachel. "Pull everything we have on Crestline Partners. I want the full history." The third week opened with a board notification that Vantage's share price had dropped 4.5% on analyst concerns about the delayed Meridian close. Emily received the alert at 6:15 in the morning and spent the 40 minutes before Michael arrived doing the kind of quiet, but controlled breathing she had learned years ago for exactly these situations, the specific, practiced calm of someone who has trained herself not to mistake urgency for emergency. The board was not just nervous now. 3 members had called her directly in the past 48 hours to register their concerns, each in the particular idiom of powerful people who want to communicate pressure while maintaining the fiction of collegial support. She received all 3 calls with the same measured professionalism she would have offered in an earnings meeting, and when each call ended she added the name to a mental list she kept of people she would remember clearly when this was over, which she had every intention of ensuring was soon. The senior team meeting that morning produced nothing actionable. Her chief strategy officer proposed a 60-day extension of the exclusivity window, which Meridian would almost certainly refuse, since it served Vantage's interests far more than theirs. Her head of corporate development suggested a partial restructure that would require walking back terms Emily had already publicly committed to in a board presentation, a move that would cost her credibility at the precise moment when she could least afford the expenditure. Her general counsel flagged 3 clauses in the current draft contract that carried more legal exposure than originally assessed. One of them, a liability cap buried in Section 14, was written in language that could, under specific conditions, expose Vantage to damages well beyond the deal's stated value. No one in the room had caught it until an outside counsel's associate had flagged it in a late-night review the previous evening. Emily read the clause during the meeting. She read it 3 times. Methodically, the way she read everything that might matter. Then she looked around the table at 9 senior executives, who were all, in various ways, waiting to see what she was going to do about a problem none of them had seen coming. And she said she needed an hour. She took her tablet and her coffee and she went down to the parking structure and she got in the back of the car. Michael was there, as he always was 8 minutes early, engine idling, the partition down because she had asked him weeks ago not to bother with it. He looked in the mirror when she got in and said nothing. She handed him the tablet with the contract clause highlighted. He took it and read it. He read it for perhaps 45 seconds, which was about 30 seconds longer than she expected it to take, and in that additional 30 seconds, she understood that he was not simply parsing the language, but mapping its implications the way a clause interacts with the broader contract, the scenarios under which it activates, the parties for whom it creates exposure, and the parties for whom it creates advantage. Then he set the tablet on the center console and looked forward. And she watched him think with the specific quality of attention that does not advertise itself. It was not the face of a man reading something new. It was the face of a man recognizing something he had seen before, in a different document, in a different year, in a different life. "This is why they brought in the second advisory firm," he said. "They knew this clause was in there, because they put it there deliberately," she said. "Not necessarily," he said, with the mild precision of someone making an important distinction. "More likely their counsel drafted it as a protective default, and their business team never fully mapped what it meant operationally. Which means, their advisory team just found it too and now they're figuring out whether to disclose it or keep it in place and hope your team doesn't notice. Given that they hired the advisory firm before surfacing it to you, they were hoping you wouldn't notice. She looked at him. How do you restructure around it? He said, You don't restructure around it. You use it. You flag it officially, which forces them to either remove it, which they'll resist because it exposes the intent regardless of origin, or explain it, which exposes their awareness differently. Either way, you've shifted the disclosure burden onto them and created a documented record that your team identified the issue, which limits your liability if the deal closes and the underlying condition ever activates. Emily was quiet for a moment. That's not a defensive play, she said. No, he agreed quietly. It's an offensive one, wrapped in compliance language. She looked at him for a long moment. The parking structure was silent around them. The fluorescent lights cast everything in the particular flat pallor of spaces designed for function rather than comfort. Come to the meeting, she said. The room went quiet in a way that is specific to moments when something deeply unexpected happens in a space governed by rigid professional hierarchy, the particular quality of silence that occurs when a social script is abandoned in real time and no one has been given the replacement. Emily introduced Michael Turner as a strategic advisor she had brought in to consult on a structural issue in the contract. She did not call him her driver. She did not explain the arrangement or offer context for why he was there. She simply said his name and the word advisor and moved forward, which was in itself a communication about whose authority was organizing the meeting. 4 of the 9 executives in the room had seen Michael in the parking structure or the building lobby over the past 3 weeks, and their faces went through a sequence of expressions, confusion, the particular social discomfort of hierarchy being reorganized in front of them. The professional awkwardness of not knowing how to position themselves relative to a person whose status has just been reclassified without warning. Her chief strategy officer, David Reeves, said with the precise and polished condescension of a man who has spent 20 years being the most senior person in any room he entered. With respect, Emily, is this really the appropriate context for an outside consultant we haven't been briefed on? Emily looked at him for exactly 1 second. Yes, she said. She nodded to Michael. What Michael Turner did in the following 45 minutes was not, Emily would reflect later, a performance. It was the opposite of a performance. It was the plain, unhurried exercise of a mind that had thought about these specific problems for a long time and had arrived at conclusions that most of the people in the room had not been in a position to reach, because reaching them required both the technical vocabulary of corporate finance and the particular clarity of someone who had stood entirely outside the machinery and watched it from a distance. He laid out the liability clause issue with clean precision, framing it not as an accusation or a crisis, but as a structural observation that required a structural response. Then he presented an analysis of Meridian's financial position that drew on publicly available data, quarterly filings, disclosed contract structures, analyst reports assembled in a configuration their own team had not put together, producing a picture of Meridian's actual pipeline value that was, when it resolved on the screen of the borrowed laptop, notably different from the picture the term sheet implied. He showed that Meridian's true pipeline, the revenue actually contracted and reasonably projectable over the acquisition's integration period, was likely 20 to 22% thinner than their submit projections suggested. He walked through the methodology without haste, pausing for questions when they came, addressing each one with the same flat, non-defensive clarity with which he had addressed Emily's questions in the car. He did not use slides. He used a legal pad and a browser window, and he spoke the way someone speaks when they are not trying to convince anyone of anything in particular, but simply reporting what they have found to be true. By the time he finished, 3 executives were taking notes, and 2 more were leaning forward in the specific way people lean when they have stopped thinking about anything except the information being presented. Reeves had stopped speaking entirely, and then the call came through from Meridian's side, a request for an urgent session, which Emily had been expecting, because she had emailed Meridian's CEO that morning to schedule it, and had written the email with the particular specificity that communicates that the requesting party knows more than they are saying, and considers the meeting non-optional. What Emily had not expected was what happened when Meridian's CEO appeared on the conference screen at the end of the table, and looked past her, at the man standing to her left with the legal pad. His expression changed. Richard Halsey was a man who had spent 30 years in rooms like this one, and had learned to control his face with considerable precision. But the change that moved across it when he saw Michael Turner was faster than control a flash of recognition, so specific and weighted that everyone in the room registered it before it was managed back into professional neutrality. He said, "Michael Turner," not a question, not a greeting. A recognition that carried the precise charge of two people who have known each other well, in a different context, arriving at an unexpected intersection in the present. Meridian's CEO, Richard Halsey, had known Michael Turner for approximately 15 years, had known him. Specifically, from the years when Michael's reputation in the mid-Atlantic deal market was the kind that gets mentioned in rooms before you arrive, the kind that precedes you in the specific way that only genuine results produce. They had collaborated on 2 transactions in the years before Crestline Partners collapsed, and Halsey had this was information that would emerge over the following hour, in the particular way that significant information surfaces when two people who already know a shared history find themselves across a table together with other people present, who do not privately attributed significant credit for both deals' structural elegance to Michael's analysis. The meeting shifted. Not dramatically, not with any single announcement, but in the particular way that the informal architecture of a conversation becomes visible when the assumptions underlying it change. Halsey began directing his comments toward Michael with the subtle, involuntary attentiveness of a man engaging with someone whose judgment he has tested and found reliable. Emily's team recognized the shift without fully understanding its source. Reeves looked as though he had arrived at a party carrying a gift for the wrong person. Michael raised the liability clause directly. He framed it not as an accusation but as a structural observation, the kind of thing. He said that both parties would benefit from resolving cleanly before close, since its current form created post-integration exposure that would complicate operations for both sides regardless of which party it was ultimately applied against. It was, he noted without editorializing, the kind of clause that tends to become a much larger problem 12 to 18 months after a transaction closes than it would be to address at the table right now. Halsey listened with his hands flat on the conference table, the deliberate body language of a man who has stopped maneuvering and is trying to hear what is actually being said. His general counsel began to speak twice and was quietly restrained by a look from Halsey both times, a look that Emily filed away as informative about the internal dynamic on Meridian's side. Michael then laid out a restructured liability architecture, a tiered cap system with defined activation conditions that limited the extreme case exposure for both parties, while preserving the commercial logic of the original deal structure. It was, Emily would later have her legal team confirm, genuinely novel in its specific configuration, not unprecedented in principle, but assembled in a way that addressed the particular asymmetries of this transaction with unusual precision. The elegance of it was not decorative, it was functional. It produced a structure that was more durable than the original, precisely because it had been built around the actual risk profile, rather than around the assumptions the original drafters had made about what the risk profile would be. It took Halsey's counsel 40 minutes to work through it in the recess that followed. When they returned, Halsey said, "We can work with this." Emily looked across the table. Then she looked at Michael. He was writing something on the legal pad, and he did not look up. The session continued for 3 more hours. Before it ended, Michael had also surfaced a secondary risk, a clause in Meridian's supplier agreements that, under the proposed acquisition structure, would create inherited liability for Vantage in certain breach scenarios that were not hypothetical but were, in fact, statistically likely given the supplier's track record in the previous 2 years. It was the kind of thing that surfaces 6 months after a close and costs twice what it would have cost to address at the negotiating table. Halsey's team had not surfaced it. Emily's team had not surfaced it. Michael had found it in a supplier contract exhibit that had been included in the data room as a routine attachment and had apparently been read by no one except him in whatever quiet hours he had spent on the documents between driving shifts. When he raised it, the room went quiet again, a different quality of quiet this time. Less social discomfort, and more the particular silence of people recalibrating their model of the situation they are in. By the time the session concluded, The earnout structure had been renegotiated to terms that were, on Emily's modeling, more favorable than the original agreement. The liability clause had been rewritten. The supplier risk had been addressed with a contractual carve-out that protected Vantage without requiring Meridian to concede more than they were willing to accept. The total effective value of the transaction, once the earnout revision and risk mitigation were factored into the net present value calculation, had increased by approximately $800,000 over the original $9 million headline figure. The deal that had been standing at the edge of collapse 2 weeks earlier had become, by the end of a single afternoon session, a better deal than the one that had been originally proposed. Driving back to the office, the city unfolding in the late afternoon light with the particular golden quality that only arrives in early autumn when the angle of the sun has shifted and the air has cleared, Emily sat in the back seat without her phone. She watched the buildings go by. Michael drove. The silence between them was different now. It had a different weight, a different texture. The way the air in a room feels different after a significant event has occurred in it, and everyone present understands, without saying it, that they are now on the other side of something. She said, after a long time, "Where did you learn to spot a clause like that?" He was quiet. Then, "The first company I tried to take public. Our outside counsel missed a supplier indemnification clause in our largest contract. We found it 3 weeks before the IPO filing. It cost us 4 months and nearly killed the raise." He paused. "You read supplier exhibits after that?" "Everyone," he said. The Meridian deal closed on a Thursday. The announcement went out at 8 in the morning, and by 9, Emily's phone had the particular kind of activity it only had after significant events, board members calling to congratulate her with the warmth of people who had privately prepared different language and were now pivoting smoothly, journalists requesting comment, her development team sending messages with the specific relieved energy of people who have been under sustained pressure and feel it release all at once. She sat in her office through the first hour of it, responding to what required response and deferring what could wait, moving through the landscape of a professional win with the efficiency of someone who has learned to receive good outcomes without being as altered by them as they are by difficult ones. The board scheduled a celebration. Her legal team issued a formal acknowledgement. Her development director, in a particularly candid moment, told her privately that this was the most complex close he had seen in 15 years of deal work. She thanked him and meant it. At 10, she called Michael. He answered on the second ring. She told him the deal had closed at the revised terms. He said he was glad to hear it. She told him to come to her office, and when he arrived 40 minutes later in the same charcoal suit that had been unremarkable 3 weeks ago and now carried a different weight entirely in her perception of it, she poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him at the table by the window rather than behind her desk, a choice she made deliberately because the desk was the geometry of hierarchy, and this was a different kind of conversation. She made him an offer. Senior strategic advisor, direct report to her, compensation at a level that reflected what his contribution to the Meridian transaction had actually been worth, and then some. She had drafted the terms herself, and she had meant every word of them. She was offering him, she believed, exactly what she would have wanted someone to offer her if their positions had been reversed. Michael Turner listened to the offer completely, without interrupting, without adjusting his expression in the direction of interest or discomfort. And then he said, "No." Emily looked at him. "No, no," he said again, with the same quietness he applied to everything, as if the word did not require force to carry its meaning. "I appreciate what you're offering. I understand why you're offering it. And I want you to know that what happened in that room matters to me, not because of what it produced professionally, but because you trusted me when you didn't have an obvious reason to." He set down his coffee. "But this isn't what I need." She waited. He looked out the window for a moment, at the city in the late morning light. "I spent 3 years behind the wheel of a car. I took that work seriously, because all work deserves to be taken seriously. And because I needed the time to understand things I hadn't understood when everything was going well, the distance from the decision-making changed how I see the way decisions get made. I don't want to give that up for a comfortable position at someone else's table. Not yet." He paused. "I know what I should have built the first time. I know what the structure should look like, what the culture should be, what I would refuse to compromise on regardless of what investors want the story to be. I need to build that myself. I need to do it on my own terms, or the understanding I've spent 3 years arriving at doesn't mean what I need it to mean. He looked at her directly. I'm not ready to be an advisor. I'm ready to be a founder again. Emily looked at him for a long time. She thought about the morning in the parking structure, the 747 light, and the charcoal suit, and the evaluative glance she had nearly acted on. She thought about how close the entire sequence had come to not happening at all, how easily a person of her efficiency and certainty could have made one clean phone call to the staffing agency and replaced one variable with another before 8 o'clock, and never known what she had replaced it with. She thought about that version of events and found it, for the first time in a long time, genuinely unsettling. Then she said, "What are you building?" He told her. It was a boutique advisory firm, focused on mid-market acquisitions in the $50 to $200 million range, the transactions where the real risk lived, not in headline valuation, but in structural details that larger advisory firms did not have the patience or incentive to read with. Real care. He had a name. He had a founding philosophy. He had a specific thesis about where value was being systematically miscalculated in the market he intended to serve, and he articulated it with the same clean precision he had applied to the liability clause analysis, which told her that he had been thinking about it for a long time in a place where precision was available to him, even when opportunity was not. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I want to invest." He looked at her. For the first time since she had met him, something moved across his face that was not quite composure, a brief, genuine moment of surprise that resolved almost immediately back into the steadiness that seemed to be his natural temperature. "You haven't seen a business plan," he said. "I've seen you read a contract," she said. "That's better." He was quiet for a moment. Then he almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The way a person smiles when something lands that they had not prepared for and find they cannot not respond to. "Let me put something together," he said. "I'll read it," she said, "every clause." He picked up his coffee. "I would expect nothing less," he said. The terms were agreed 3 weeks later. Over 2 focused hours at a conference table, in a building neither of them owned, in a meeting that ran without preamble, and without the extended social negotiation that had characterized every Meridian session, Emily invested at a valuation that reflected her assessment of the asset, rather than the comparable market rate for a firm with no operating history, which was a distinction she was comfortable making because she had done the analysis herself and stood behind it. Michael founded Turner Advisory Partners and opened its doors on a Monday in early spring, in offices that were modest by the standards of the industry and deliberately chosen a signal, he said, about what the firm existed to do, which was not to impress clients with real estate, but to produce outcomes that spoke without the assistance of beautiful lobbies. He had 2 analysts with the specific combination of technical rigor and genuine curiosity that he had screened for over 3 months of patient searching. He had a junior associate who had come recommended by a professor at a business school neither of them had attended, which Michael considered a good sign. He had a set of operating principles he had written himself and posted on the wall beside his desk, not as decoration, not as a marketing artifact, but as a working document he referred to in actual decisions, which the people who worked for him understood was the difference between a firm with principles and a firm with a poster. Emily came to the opening and stayed for 40 minutes and declined the small talk circuit in favor of a direct conversation with the junior associate about deal structure methodology, which the associate would describe to colleagues for the better part of a year afterward as one of the most useful 40 minutes of her early career. They spoke regularly after that, not as employer and employee, not in the careful idiom of investor managing a portfolio company, but in the more honest register of 2 people who had each seen the other clearly at a particular moment under particular pressure and had decided, independently and without discussion, that clarity of that kind was worth maintaining. Michael closed his first independent transaction 8 months after the firm's founding, a $14 million acquisition in the logistics sector, handled with the kind of methodical precision that does not announce itself but produces outcomes that speak plainly. Emily followed the transaction closely. She was not surprised by the outcome. She had not been surprised by Michael Turner in a long time. What she thought about, on occasion in the particular quiet of a long day when the building had emptied and the light through the windows had gone flat and amber, the quality of light she associated with the end of things well concluded, was the morning in the parking structure, the 8 minutes before 7:50. The charcoal suit that asked nothing of anyone. The calm face of a man who had already lost everything once and had arrived, in the years after, somewhere on the other side of that loss that most people never find their way to, because most people spend the years after loss trying to return to what they had, rather than understanding what the loss was trying to teach them. She thought about the dismissive glance she had almost acted on. She thought about how close the entire sequence had come to not happening. One phone call, one replacement driver from the agency, one morning that passed without those 3 words from the front seat of a moving car. She thought about what that version of events would have cost her, not in the currency of the Meridian transaction, but in the less quantifiable currency of a lesson about the difference between a person's visible circumstances and the actual dimensions of who they are. On the day Emily Carter hired Michael Turner as her personal driver, she believed with the confident and entirely reasonable certainty of a woman who had built a significant career on the accuracy of her judgment about people that she was doing him a small and unremarkable favor. She had a car that needed driving. He had a license and a need, and the kind of references that cleared the basic threshold of professional adequacy. The transaction seemed clean and limited and temporary, the kind of arrangement that would last perhaps a few weeks and leave no particular trace on either side. She had been wrong about that, as she had been wrong about very little in her professional life. And the particular quality of that wrongness, its depth, its specificity, its refusal to resolve into anything simple had produced something she had not anticipated and could not have engineered by any deliberate means. The best deal of her career, a partnership she had not been looking for, and the durable, precise satisfaction of discovering that the most valuable person in any room is sometimes the one that everyone else, in their efficient and reasonable assessments, has already decided does not belong there.